Hello everyone, thanks for coming. I'm presenting our research on an issue of video game regulation. In particular, this is the regulation of a potentially harmful, quasi-gambling, randomized monetization method found in video games. You may know them as loot boxes. Over the last 3 years, loot boxes have faced public controversy and scrutiny by regulators due to their similarity with gambling. So what is a loot box? Loot boxes are virtual, consumable items in video games that can be opened by players to obtain randomized rewards of variable in-game and real-world value. Some loot boxes cost real money. Other loot boxes can be obtained for free by performing in-game actions such as defeating an enemy, playing for a set amount of time, or simply logging into the game. Our research focuses on paid loot boxes, which are seemingly more harmful as they can directly cause overspending of real money by players. However, please bear in mind that even non-paid loot boxes could potentially be harmful because they normalize gambling behaviors, especially when children are exposed to them. Some games allow for player trading, enabling loot box rewards to be transferred between players. These systems may enable players to sell in-game items for real-world money, rather than simply exchanging one in-game item for another. This means that these loot box rewards gain real-world monetary value, where a game does not allow transfer of in-game items. The items only have in-game value. Some rewards are just cosmetic. For example, they may make your sword glow, or give you gold rather than silver armor, without any increase in power. Other rewards actually influence gameplay. For example, they could unlock additional content or give the player a competitive advantage over other players. Take the example of the reward that makes your sword glow. A reward with a competitive advantage would mean that this glowing sword deals twice as much damage to enemies, for example. This would mean that players who pay for loot boxes can become stronger than other players, encouraging other players to buy loot boxes so they can compete with these players on a more equal footing. This may create a stronger incentive to buy loot boxes which give a competitive advantage over those which are merely cosmetic. How much do people spend on loot boxes? We don't have conclusive data on loot box spending because this data is held by game companies and they don't release their loot box sales data to the public. However, estimates have been made. Total global loot box related spending has been estimated to be around $30 billion in 2018, expected to rise to $50 billion in 2022. Player trading is also significant, with the virtual items of just 3 Steam games having been transacted 1.4 billion times with an aggregated value of over $1 billion. Extreme cases of loot box spending have been reported in mainstream media, such as one UK player spending nearly $700 in 1 month. Another player discovered that he had spent over $10,000 in just 2 years on the loot boxes of one single game, by requesting his personal data from the game company using data protection legislation. This case also demonstrates that game companies do retain data on individual players' loot box spending, and so they also have data on total loot box spending by all players of their games. The BBC also reported in 2019 on a case where 4 children spent nearly £550 on loot boxes without permission, and still didn't get the item they were after. These cases may indicate that the video game industry has a significant financial interest in loot boxes, which may incentivize them to maintain the continued lack of regulation. This lack of regulation impacts many people across the world, including vulnerable groups such as children. Therefore, the regulation of loot boxes may be justifiable to prevent potential gambling-related harms and, regardless of whether they fall foul of gambling laws, to ensure consumer protection in general. The first potential harm of loot boxes is their structural similarities to gambling. They both involve the player, or gambler, paying an amount of money with the hope of obtaining more money or something more valuable through a randomized process. Essentially, when you describe them, loot boxes sound like gambling. Secondly, empirical evidence has consistently established there is a relationship between loot boxes and problem gambling. Specifically, the more severe that participants' problem gambling was, the more money they spent on loot boxes. However, we do not know if loot boxes cause people to become problem gamblers, or if people who are already problem gamblers are more likely to spend a lot of money on loot boxes. Thirdly, loot boxes may abuse our natural, irrational decision-making biases, causing players to spend more money than they had originally intended. These decision-making biases, such as entrapment, the gambler's fallacy, and the near-miss effect, have been experimentally demonstrated to cause overspending in the context of gambling, and so may also be applicable to the loot box context. Some research on loot box prevalence has already been conducted. Loot boxes have become prevalent across all major gaming platforms. They have been found in 56% of the top-grossing mobile games and 36% of the top-grossing desktop games. The fact that 46.2% of video game players reported buying loot boxes shows the extent of their influence on this industry. We are particularly concerned about children and other vulnerable groups being exposed to loot boxes. 93% of Android games containing loot boxes were deemed suitable for children aged 12, and 57% were deemed suitable for children aged just 7 years old. 22.9% of UK 11 to 16-year-olds have paid for loot boxes. Loot box prevalence research so far has focused only on Western countries. Also, it has never assessed the effectiveness of attempts to regulate loot boxes. Research on the effectiveness of regulation, used thus far, is needed to guide further regulation to ensure effective consumer protection. As of yet, the People's Republic of China is the only country to regulate loot boxes through a consumer protection measure. This measure requires video game companies using loot boxes in their games to disclose the probabilities of obtaining these possible rewards. However, the method or location of disclosure is not specified, as we will soon explore. For illustration, we see here two different examples of probability disclosures. On the left-hand example, we can see that if we bought this loot box, we would have a 5% chance of obtaining an item of 5-star rarity. On the right-hand example, we can see probabilities disclosed for specific items. For example, a player can see that when they buy a loot box in this game, they will have a 1% chance of obtaining a New Year's kite. Probability disclosure regulations have precedents in gambling law, such as in the UK. Experience of such regulations indicates that these industries do not disclose the information in the most effective ways, so their ability to improve and inform the choices made by consumers becomes limited. When used ineffectively, these measures could even end up inhibiting consumer choice. For example, important information to consumers can be hidden in the small print, rather than long, complex legal documents, which means that the information is unlikely to ever be brought to their attention. This emphasizes the importance of assessing the effectiveness of disclosure methods. On the prevalence of loot boxes in China, we found that 91% of the top-grossing iPhone games contain loot boxes, significantly higher than in the UK. 90.5% of games deemed suitable for children aged 12 contain loot boxes, again much higher than in the UK. As for compliance, 4.4% of the 100 top-grossing iPhone games did not disclose probabilities. Games are recorded as compliant whether they made the disclosure on the loot box in-game purchase screen or on the game's official website, or both. In order to ensure that as many people as possible find the disclosure to be accessible, thereby maximising consumer protection, the disclosure should be found at both locations, but only 34.1% of games did this. Even within the category of in-game disclosures, the accessibility of disclosure is extremely varied. I'll take us through examples of each category, from those considered most accessible to the least accessible. So, 9.6% of in-game disclosures actually display the probabilities straight away on the purchase screen without any further interaction from the player. When a player purchases a loot box, it's guaranteed that they will see the probabilities before doing so. 11.5% used a small generic symbol, but labelled it in order to show that it contained the probabilities disclosure. 55.8% used a small generic symbol, such as this eye for information in the bottom right corner, or this question mark in the top left corner, which the player taps, and then the probabilities are shown. 15.4% of in-game disclosures began with a small generic symbol, but then required some extra steps. This game, for example, required 3 taps and some scrolling. Not all interested players may end up completing all these steps. 5.8% of in-game disclosures were accessed through a graphic element on the purchase screen. This game, for example, unexpectedly requires players to tap an incense burner, which looks like part of the background art, in order to see the probabilities. This game requires players to tap specifically on these tiny white arrows. As with the incense burner, these game companies are surely aware there is little chance of players finding these probability disclosures. In this game, tapping the character's profile will lead to the probability disclosure. Additionally, at the bottom of the screen, it says that a more detailed disclosure can be found on the game's official website, but there is no disclosure at all on the game's website, so this is false. Finally, 1.9% of in-game disclosures could only be accessed by chatting with a customer support bot. This is clearly quite removed from the purchasing process. Also, note that the game is entirely in Chinese, but the customer support bot is only in English. We can see in the second panel the bot does not understand if you request the probabilities in Chinese. If a determined player does finally manage to access the disclosure, we can see in the right-hand panel they'll be faced with a daunting and almost illegible format. Now, I'll also show examples of the variability disclosures made on games' official websites. 9.1% of these games' official websites had a link on the homepage itself, which takes you to the probability disclosures. These links are accessible from every page on the website, but as you can see, they are quite inconspicuous. 1.5% of official website-based disclosures were published under a separate tab dedicated to probabilities, which is comparatively conspicuous. 3% of official website-based disclosures were under the News tab, pinned to the top of other news posts. 78.8% of official website-based disclosures listed the probabilities for their loot boxes under a News tab, but listed them chronologically along with other posts. This could end up requiring a lot of scrolling from the player before they find the probabilities they're looking for. Also, many games have several loot boxes, and each loot box's probabilities are disclosed individually within this chronological list of news, making it even harder to find individual disclosures. Finally, for 7.6% of official website-based disclosures, the disclosures were not accessible at all when navigating the website from the homepage. Unless the player already somehow knew the URL, they would have to use a search engine to find the disclosure. To summarize, only 9.6% of in-game disclosures were displayed automatically on the purchase screen. This is clearly the most accessible form of in-game disclosure, as it ensures that every player who may purchase a loot box is made aware of the probabilities of obtaining the rewards. For official website-based disclosures, we consider that disclosures which can be accessed from the game's homepage, displayed under a dedicated tab, or pinned to the top of a list of posts were accessible forms of disclosure. These forms only accounted for 13.6% of website-based disclosures. In short, video game companies tended to fail to maximize the visibility of their disclosures. This is bound to impact the effectiveness of the consumer protection provided by the regulation. In conclusion, it is clear that loot boxes are very prevalent in China, even more so than in Western countries. Additionally, only a minority of loot box probability disclosures were reasonably prominent. Finally, in order to ensure maximum consumer protection, we recommend that legal regulation and/or self-regulation by the video game industry targeting loot boxes should require that probability disclosures are both uniform and prominent. A few other ethical game design measures to consider include setting maximum spending limits in order to prevent overspending by individual players, ensuring that loot box rewards do not provide a competitive advantage and unfairly induce players to purchase them in order to win more games, not offering loot boxes containing rewards that are only available for a limited amount of time, such that the player is pressured to make a decision to purchase within a time limit, and ensuring that loot box rewards can realistically be obtained through methods other than randomized purchase. For example, by also allowing players to get them after defeating certain enemies, or by allowing players to purchase the rewards directly without any randomization mechanic. We are planning a further study into whether Chinese players are aware of the disclosure regulations. We'll be conducting a survey into this and would really appreciate your help. So please get in contact with us if you may be able to help us pass out surveys. Thank you for watching. We look forward to hearing your questions to the panel discussion, and if you have any further questions, please get in touch with our team using any of these methods.